Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello and welcome back to the show. Our brains are intricate organs that govern our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. But beyond that, they are also key players in determining our longevity and cognitive health. So, in this episode, we're examining the fascinating relationship between brain activity and aging, exploring how our mental processes can influence our lifespan and cognitive abilities. And joining us today is Associate Professor Max Shine, who is currently a joint NHMRC Bellberry Fellow at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. So, hi, Mac. Welcome to the show. How are you going today?
Hi, Marie. Nice to be here to chat with you. I'm doing really well.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here. And, the area of brain health is rather elusive to me, as I imagine it would be for most people. So, tell us a bit about your work and what it entails in layperson terms, if possible.
Yeah, sure. So my group is what's called a computational neuroscience group, which means that we take things like computational abilities like using mathematics and physics and big kind of computer programs, and we try to use them to distill down the complexity of the brain's activity. As you might imagine, the brain being this incredibly complex organ that we don't really understand, the real challenge at the moment for groups like mine is to try to synthesize down that complexity to something that we can understand. And we can then use those syntheses, those kind of summaries, to try to test ideas about how it works. And we use computational models for that.
Wow, that sounds really impressive. And it's also a great introduction to our topic for today. But before we get further into detail, we'd love to get to know you better. So, this is Have You Met Mac? And the first question I have for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
So I'm a father of two young boys. Tyler and Callan just turned 13 and 10. So I spend a lot of my time chasing them around. And we're all pretty sports mad. So my son Callan loves soccer. I watch Man City with him. And my son Tyler loves American football. So we watch a lot of American football on TV. So I spend a lot of my spare time doing that.
Oh, that's really nice. Are you a Man City fan?
My son Callan is. I'm learning slowly to
Ah,
become a Man City fan. But they had a good game this morning we watched, which was great fun.
yeah. Okay, cool. I'm not really into sports at all, but my the males in my family are my dad, my brothers, and I've heard that Man City isn't doing too well lately. Is that accurate at all, or?
Yeah, so they actually had a pretty devastating injury about a month ago to one of their best
Oh,
players, Rodri, who's a central defensive midfielder. And one of the main amazing things that Man City do is they actually use their defenders to actually create attacking pressure in football, and it completely changes the way the game can be played. And he
mhm.
unfortunately had a non-contact knee injury, and they've really struggled to replace him in the lineup and find a player with his particular set of skills to kind of recreate that magic. So they're figuring it out. They've got a great talented squad and they're still winning games, but a little bit of that Pep Guardiola magic, I think, is needed to get them to the next level.
Right. Oh, that's really unfortunate. Well, apart from watching soccer, football, and chasing your kids around, in your words, do you have any other interests aside from what you do for work?
So I used to play drums when I was in high school. So I'm a bit of a music fan. And so I listen to lots of music and play drums at home. I really love doing puzzles as well. That's kind of my favorite way to kind of calm my brain down. So I sort of churn through jigsaw puzzles in the background just to kind of keep myself active.
Yeah, puzzles are always fun. I really like crossword and Sudoku, which aren't quite jigsaw puzzles, but they are form of puzzle, I suppose. And drums, that's pretty cool. What kind of drums do you play?
I have an electronic drum kit at home, a kind of old Roland drum kit, which is electronic, which is nice because it means I can plug my headphones in and listen to music and kind of pretend like I'm drumming as well as the people on Spotify that I'm listening to. My skills have kind of diminished over the years, so it's more delusion now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that electronic drums are for sure the pragmatic way to go if you have a family. Like the people who have non-electronic drums are the ones who don't have kids, probably.
Yeah. Or very patient wives. Yeah.
Yeah. So the last question I have for you before we end off this section is, who do you look up to either in your professional life or your personal life?
Yeah, it's a great question. As a scientist, there's tons and tons of people in your lives that essentially you're following in the footsteps of. That there's an old, really brilliant saying by Isaac Newton, which is that to discover anything in science, you have to stand on the shoulders of giants. And so there's just honestly too many to thank for kind of where you can get to as an individual scientist. Probably my biggest inspiration now that I'm a sort of team manager, I've a sort of small team of scientists that I work with, is I take inspiration from really sporting coaches and sort of captains that I've followed over the years. And one that I really admire is still coaching, actually. He actually coaches basketball for the San Antonio Spurs, Greg Popovich. And he's just got this incredible way of getting to know the players as people and help motivate them and find the thing that drives them and help them actually create a cohesive whole. There's really no ego in that team. They really work for a greater good. And so I actually try to use a lot of the techniques and practices that Popovich uses, along with other sporting coaches, to try to help motivate my team and sort of show them this big, massive challenge we have in front of us. Trying to understand how our brain works is going to require all of us working together, both within our group and with the broader community. And I try to bring a lot of those ideas together into a scientific domain and leverage it from sports.
Wow, that's really nice to hear. I mean, I feel like it takes so much to make a good leader, because a good leader is one who doesn't just, it's not just about leading the team, it's also about inspiring your team. It's not just about like giving orders and like telling people what to do, it's definitely about like I guess creating that motivation and finding out what their drivers are, and letting them figure that out too. So that's really nice to hear. Thank you so much for sharing that about yourself. I feel like I got to know you a bit better. So let's move on to the interview now. The first thing that we like to start off with is key definitions, key terms. How would you define longevity?
It's a great question. My work is not exactly focused on trying to understand how brains age, but we do come across this big challenge in my work trying to understand how a normal, healthy brain works, but also how it starts to break down in disorders of aging, like dementia. And so, in the context of a disorder like dementia, we think of longevity as the ability to retain normal, healthy cognitive functions sort of into the later stages of life. And quite remarkably, there's a huge variation across the population of cognitive abilities, really into the later stages of life. And there's some studies in the world that have actually gone out to specifically find what they call super ages, these people that have been able to maintain, really, really robust abilities to think and manage their own lives and be really adaptive to the challenges that they face, which they can't predict ahead of time. And they can really last into the kind of ninth decade. Even people that are older than 100 can really still be quite cognitively switched on. And yet at the same time, you can also see people that unfortunately develop disorders quite early in life. Yeah. Even around middle age. I'm 42, and people around my age can actually develop cognitive decline. And so it's a really, really difficult topic to try to broach, but we really try to think about that axis as best we can.
Yeah, and brain science can be rather elusive to most people as well. So, what exactly are we referring to when we discuss brain activity?
Yeah, it's another really great question. There's got probably two ways to think about that. You can think about the way the brain actually is, this, physical organ inside of our skulls with little neurons that are connected to one another with little wires that we call axons. And they can interact with one another by sending little chemicals across a gap, which is called a synapse between these little cells. but they themselves are kind of built into this gigantic network of billions of cells with trillions of connections between them. In fact, we love to say in our grants that there's more connections in an individual brain than there are stars in the Milky Way. It's just an astronomically large number. But taking the brain as it is one thing, but we also have to think about how we can actually measure the brain. And that's actually very different than what the brain's actually doing itself. And we have lots of different measurements for the brain. Each of them have some aspects that are really positive and some that are a little bit challenging. So, for example, the best thing we could do would be to have a probe that actually went directly into the brain and recorded from an individual neuron. But that's obviously really invasive, right? And that comes with the big challenge that we really can't do in humans. And so this happens a lot in animal models, things like studies in mice or monkeys. And in the rare cases where people go into surgery with neurosurgeons, they'll actually have direct access to their brain. Let's say if they're trying to remove a tumor or find the focus of epilepsy. But usually what we have to do in my field of neuroscience is actually indirectly measure the brain without actually becoming invasive. And to do that, you've got a couple different choices. One of them is to measure what we call the electrical potentials of the brain. This is a little bit like measuring the kind of electrical activity, the kind of pooled activity of all these little spikes that happen inside the brain. And then another one is using magnets, basically, a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, which is quite miraculous. But now we're measuring something indirect, like the amount of blood that's flowing around the brain. But in both cases, what we can do is we can kind of infer afterwards, if we saw a signal in a particular location that was suggestive of the activity, which is how we think the brain's actually working underneath it. And we try to use really powerful statistics and computational approaches to try to understand how you could actually triangulate those coordinates. But it's a really, really difficult space and a lot of very complicated mathematics and statistics to try to make these guesses. It's not a direct readout the way it would be if we just sort of looked at something like an echocardiogram of your heart.
Yeah, for sure. And what connection does this have to cognitive health from what you know so far?
So everything that we do in this space is, as I mentioned, kind of comes with a lot of caveats because a lot of the measurements that we're recording from individual brains are quite noisy and indirect. And so oftentimes what we have to do when we design studies is we have to create a big corpus of data. We have to scan lots and lots of different people across a big population and then try to find a relationship between how those people would perform on a cognitive test. Imagine playing a really hard game of Sudoku and we could figure out how many mistakes you made or how long it took you to do it. And then on the other hand, we've got an indirect measure of, let's say, how thick one part of your brain is that we think is important for cognitive function, or how coordinated two different systems in your brain were through this indirect measurement. We can now see whether or not the variable that we have on the one hand, the measurement of the brain, and the variable we have on the other hand, your performance, are they related together? So that the worse you perform on that task, the more coupled or uncoupled these parts of the brain are or something. So you have these really indirect relationships that are, I think, still really kind of important guideposts to what might be going wrong.
Yeah.
But they're not really a smoking gun in the way that we would like yet. And this is a real challenge with neuroscience. It's a really, really big, complicated space. The brain's complicated, massive, complicated organ. And the tests that we have to actually measure it are really, really hard to pin down sometimes.
Yeah.
So as a concrete example, you could imagine getting a Sudoku question wrong by putting the wrong number in one of the wrong rows or the wrong columns, or you could actually, make an incorrect guess way ahead of time to rule out a particular number that was based on the bad logic. And those are both errors. They're completely different categories, but they show up in the same way. And so it's really, really difficult to navigate this space in a coherent way. But fortunately, we have lots of bright young students that are coming in, tackling this problem head first and trying to figure out the right ways to go forward. But it's really early days in the field.
Yeah, it sounds so complex because there's this thing in science, right, where correlation doesn't mean causation. And with all of these indirect relationships, you always kind of have to ask yourself that. Well, now that I'm hearing from you, it sounds like brain science is elusive to brain scientists themselves.
Well, I don't mean to disparage my community completely. There are actually really, really great ways to do causal testing in neuroscience. Probably the best ones that we have now do require the kinds of techniques that only really we work in animals. So studies in mice, in flies, in worms, and then things that are more complex and a little bit more like us, like monkeys. There are experiments that can be done where you can actually come in now and directly activate or silence very specific cells in the brain while an awake animal performs a cognitive task. Now, we can't train animals to play Sudoku, but we can make them make really difficult decisions based on really, really uncertain evidence, or we can have them navigating a virtual maze and figuring out whether or not they should turn left or right. These really, really difficult, interesting cognitive problems. And then we can go and turn it on and off different cells, or we can record really precisely from them. And so we get really, really robust precise causal evidence in an animal. Yeah. But the challenge is there, you can't turn around and ask the mouse why they did what they did in the same way that I could ask you why you put the 2 in that row for Sudoku. Yeah. So what we're advocating for really now at the kind of level of the communities of neuroscience is an integration between the communities that work on the animals with the really precise recordings and the communities that work on humans with their really easy access to self-report or the sophisticated cognitive things that we humans can do quite easily that animals find challenging. What we really think we need is a bridge between these different fields such that we can take the insights that are developed down in the animal models and bring them up into the human level to understand what's going wrong and then hopefully devise better diagnostic tests or better treatments of these awful disorders that impact later life.
Wow, that's really interesting. Such a process.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But it's a great time to be involved if you're a young student and you're interested in this space.
Yeah, for sure. So based on the research that's out there so far, what are the key factors that influence brain and cognitive health?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer with much precision, but a lot of the things that make cognitive play a role in cognitive health are the same kinds of things that play a role in just your general health and well-being. So getting regular exercise, eating a healthy diet, getting a really good night's sleep and regular sleep that's about the same duration, but also things that are a bit more specific to cognitive health. I think staying active and socially engaged is incredibly important, particularly in the kind of modern world where we sort of tend to live a lot of our lives online in this kind of relationship with a small black screen in front of our face rather than another person. And also things like constantly embracing novelty. So what I mean by that is the kinds of challenges that our brain really thrives on is when different rules get broken and you've got to then reinvigorate a new understanding of what's going on. And so I like to say, whenever my parents ask me this kind of a question, what can we be doing to help encourage, cognitive abilities later into life? Say, give yourself a challenge, try a new skill, learn to do a new game on your phone, go to a new social interaction. You've got to meet new people. If you can afford it, go on a holiday and see something new you've never seen before and challenge your preconceived notions about how that culture works. Because what you're essentially doing every single one of these times is you're forcing your brain to take on some new challenge and you're learning how to incorporate that into your existing set of abilities. And that helps you grow and feed the brain with new information. And I think this is a really interesting new space. We're still trying to figure out how to test this properly, but there's encouraging signs that this is the kind of mode that we need to be operating in to keep our brains healthy into later life.
Oh, I love the sound of that. I really enjoy novelty. Novelty is underrated for sure. So out of all of this, how would you describe the relationship between the brain and longevity?
Yeah, so I think as I tried to preface earlier, it's a really, really difficult space to draw, I think, straight lines. I think one of the things that we are learning is that taking good care of your brain early in life has a big impact on whether or not you'll have long-term longevity. But there's obviously lots of other individual factors that play into this in terms of genetics, in terms of the kinds of socioeconomic status that you had as a child and into later life, whether you have access to healthy foods and the ability to exercise and things like this. So it's a really, really difficult space to draw strong conclusions. I think we just need more work and more time to really think about how to do this properly. And one thing I will say that I think is really important when we try to draw these lines is that neuroscience as a field is still really in its infancy, in the sense that we don't have really strong models of how the brain works in the same way that we understand how a heart works or how a kidney works or how a liver works. And because we don't have those really sort of simple synthesized models, it's much harder to say when the brain stops working in the way that we know that it works. So you could go and do a study in later life. You could find people that have really, really robust cognition and really, really poor cognition. But at the end of the day, all you're doing, as you said before, is correlating some brain measure with that ability. What would be really awesome is if we could say, here's what a normal brain ought to look like in all of the different measures that we have at this stage. And did a person's brain deviate from that model earlier or later, and they ended up having poor cognition or poor cognition on those tests. And we don't yet have that. So one of the things that my group's really excited in is trying to push towards that space where we have a good understanding in general of how a brain should work. This bit should connect to that bit. This bit influences that. And if we have that model, now we'll have a much more sophisticated ability to actually pick out the deviations from that model. And this is actually super important for a lot of neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, things like this, because in a lot of those cases, the damage to the brain is actually occurring way before you actually notice a problem in the individual's ability to, say, remember the shopping list or to actually move their arms. There's a lot of resiliency in the brain. And the problem is that by the time we notice, the damage is actually really, really sort of baked into the brain's structure. And so what we'd really, really like to do is to find that problem way before the damage has gotten so bad that we can't fix it, and then apply different drugs or different interventions at that stage. But we're really not at that stage yet. We need more funding and more bright young people to come help us figure out how to do this properly.
Yeah, that would be entirely groundbreaking for sure. So I do hope we get there at some point too.
It's going to take a
Yeah.
village. Yeah.
Yeah, needless to say, but I did say it. Yeah, so I feel like we have gotten a good snapshot of what brain science means, what brain activity means, and how it's connected to our longevity. So, what types of brain activity are there?
So I think the best way to think about it is the different scale at which you're analyzing the brain. So one of the things that makes brains really tricky to study is that they're organized down at a cellular level. That means that there's individual little cells, we call them neurons, and supporting cells called glia that form these vast networks of activity. But they all work together a little bit like the way an orchestra works, but it's composed of instruments. So you could either go and analyze, if you want to understand how an orchestra works, you could either go and look at one of the individual instruments. You could even go inside an instrument and look at this, the E string on the first violin, or you could actually look at the summed activity of the whole orchestra, and you could listen to a recording of the violins playing with the brass, playing with the percussion and the conductor. And one of the challenges we have is that neither of those descriptions is perfect. Then neither one's right and the other one's wrong. They're all just different ways of describing this emergent property of an orchestra. And this analogy is actually directly true for the brain. You could go in and study individual neurons or subcompartments within an individual neuron within the brain, and you could learn something really important about how it works. But you could just as equally record from the entire brain and try to understand how the entire brain works as a sort of coordinated symphony. And both of those levels and everything in between are going to have really important information for you to understand how the system works. And this actually makes our job even harder. But there's some recent inroads to suggest that these different levels have interesting connections that we can start to track. And there's more and more conversations between people that are working down at the microscopic level that are studying the strings on the violin and the people working at the top of the macroscopic level that are studying the whole orchestra. And we're starting to get more and more sophisticated conversations, in our case, that we call these models of how these systems interact. And it's an exciting time to be a neuroscientist in this space, because now we have the computational power to actually ask these questions and the recordings that we can start to match together. But as I say, it's very early days.
Yeah. So given that brain activity is more like a symphony and an orchestra, would I be correct to say that there isn't anything in like particular that is positively or negatively associated with longevity, and it's more about like overall?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We're still trying to figure this out. So let me give you an example that's not related to longevity, but I think helps to illustrate this question. So neural activity, I don't think you can think of as either bad or good. It's really about the context in which it occurs. And so a really great example where neural activity can be bad is an area called epilepsy. So people will be familiar with things like epilepsy. They're associated with this disorders. There's multiple different causes, but the thing that binds them together is that people have what's called synchronous activity in their brain. So synchronous activity is a little bit like if the orchestra all started playing the same note together, right? And so now all of a sudden you hear that note very, very loud, but the complexity of the music and what I mean by that is how all the different notes can play together is completely lost because you've just got this one signal coming up and down. It turns out that in our waking lives, while you and I are having this conversation, while people are listening on whichever podcasting service they're listening to, the brain activity that's happening in their brain is extremely complex. There's some part of their brain activity that's listening to my voice. There's some part that's thinking of an idea. There's some part that's looking at what's in front of them. There's another part that feels the pressure of the seat underneath them, that feels the pressure of their shoes. There might be a smell in the air as well. So our brains are extremely complex. And so if you simplify this activity too much, it's actually a huge problem for the brain. If it becomes too synchronous, you've lost all that complexity and people end up having what are called epileptic seizures. So in this case, I've now given you an example where brain activity was extremely important for measuring, for processing the smell, the sound, the sights, the touch, the ideas, the concepts. You need the complexity to actually be processing all the world around you. But if the complexity gets diminished, still with neural activity, you've now had an epileptic seizure. And so you can see how it's really, really difficult to actually say neural activity is bad or good. It's the context in which it occurs that's actually really important. And we're still really trying to understand this at a high level as a field. There's no consensus as to exactly the right way to find an epileptic seizure before it happens, or exactly the right way to measure whether or not your brain is processing the smell over the sound, over the touch. We're still trying to figure out that kind of language as a field.
Yeah, for sure. It's really, really complicated. I also found a study that was published in 2019 suggesting that excessive neural activity in the brain is linked to shorter lifespan and that suppressing that extra activity could prolong it. Essentially, the researchers found that a protein called REST may be able to reduce neural activity and extend lifespan. And this was tested mostly on worms and mice. So this seems to open up a lot of doors, but what are your thoughts on this? What else would we need to know before having any definitive health recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the obvious one is to go through the appropriate steps to sort of create actual clinical trials that then go through and actually sort of test this both in different species, but also then in humans, ensuring that the different kinds of chemicals that they find as biomarkers in the case of RES. As a spoiler, I'm not aware of this particular paper, so I don't want to speak to the specifics, but in a lot of these studies, what they will do is they'll find a correlation between, let's say, neural activity and diminished longevity, and then they'll go and see if they can find different genes that relate to that neural activity. There's another question, which is, does that particular gene or the gene products of that gene have an impact on other kinds of systems in the body or in the brain? And if we were to remove it, is there a consequence to that removal that then has an adverse side effect? And so there's actually been a quite frustratingly poor track record of translating key results in species like mice to humans because of the complexity of our genetic environment and the differences that we have in our biochemistry. And so we really need to do a better job as a field of actually joining the dots. And this is another reason that we're really advocating for this stronger bridge between the fields that are sort of working in animals and the fields that work in humans. We need much more work to be done at that intersection in order to actually foster better translation between these different fields. Yeah.
Yeah. And more on the practical side of things, in what ways do lifestyle factors that you mentioned before, like diet, sleep, stress management, from what we know so far, affect brain health and longevity by extension?
Yeah, so I can't really speak to any specific studies. It's not my exact area of expertise, but I think the recommendation I would make is that the kinds of things that are generally associated with being physically healthy, like good diet, good sleep, um, things of that nature, are going to be helpful for long-term brain health. And so, just general basic health recommendations are probably the best way to go for now.
And with our increasingly busy lives and the overuse of digital interaction, I mean, now we use our phones to pay for things, more of us are prone to chronic stress. It's an increasingly normalized thing. So, what effect would this have on our brains?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think a lot of our current maladies as a society, both in Australia and I think globally, are due to our inability to really incorporate appropriately this kind of newfound digital technology into our day to day lives in ways that are actually balanced with the other kinds of needs that we have. And I notice this. My wife and I talk about it a lot. I notice this with my kids. Their generation is really kind of embedded in this digital world in a way that I think has some really amazing benefits. They are connected across the world to people that they wouldn't have been connected to before. My older son was able to play a game with his cousin who lives in America, in real time, and that's an incredible thing that I never got to experience when I was a child. But that also comes with these some other really big downsides. I think kids nowadays are exposed to adult content in a way that is really problematic for their development and very confusing for them as young children. And so our best strategy is to essentially discuss that as best we can as just, really it's like a sort of social solution rather than a neural solution. In terms of what effect chronic stress is going to have on the brain, I think it's not just the brain that chronic stress is going to affect. Biological organisms, of which we are one, are really a series of feedback loops. We want to maintain a homeostasis. We want to keep our blood pressure in a particular range. We want to keep our temperature in a particular range. And to do so, we have a series of different checks and balances. If we get stressed, that pushes our system into a different type of a mode, which is trying to promote what we call fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system. The problem with that mode, it's really useful if you want to run away from a predator. It's really, really useful if you want to find your way out of a difficult problem. But it actually has detrimental effects on the kinds of growth and reorganization that our brain needs to actually essentially keep the system clean and coherent for a long period of time. So living in a period of chronic stress is actually really sort of benefiting. You can think of it a little bit like pushing you towards the short term, but not caring so much about the long term. It's going to make a lot of internal changes in that regard. So one of the things I would really advocate, or it's very simple advice, is if you're finding yourself to be stressed, try to figure out the things that you can do to reduce that stress and think more about the fact you've got plenty of time, putting down that phone and just going for a walk, being out in nature. These things are really simple solutions that can have a huge impact on your long-term longevity.
Yeah, I think this would be a great point to go into some practical habits that we can do in our day-to-day lives. So overall, based on the research that's out there, what are some habits, activities, or exercises that you recommend practicing for maintaining our brain health and promoting that longevity?
Yeah, I'm wary of giving you evidence-based recommendations because it's not my exact area, but I can tell you a little bit about what I do as a neuroscientist in this modern world. I try to do my best to do anything that I can do off of my computer. So I try to conduct meetings on a phone and then go for a walk while I'm talking to my students. I try to get outdoors as best I can, get sunlight, take breaks to play with my dogs. When my kids come home from school, I try to completely detach from that kind of world that I'm in at work and go into their world and understand how their lives are and do a lot of switching between different tasks. Try to, eat healthily, exercise regularly, do your best to kind of keep things as varied as possible. But I don't think there's any magic bullet. I think that general kinds of basic health strategies are going to be really good in the long run. And don't forget the old doctor's truism, everything in moderation is a really wise way to go about living your life. And if you're finding that upon reflection that you're spending a lot of time on a computer screen or on your phone, that's not moderation. And you should try to moderate that by building in other kinds of factors that will then keep you in a better balance.
And what do you think are the main challenges that arise from attempting to go outside and detach from digital interaction a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think we really noticed this really acutely during the pandemic a couple of years ago. I know it feels like it was about 10,000 years ago, but it really was,
Mhm.
I think, a big wake up call for us as a society. How do we go about balancing our time when we don't have some of the freedoms that we were accustomed to? And I noticed this actually really acutely with my students. My wife and I and our kids, we live on the central coast of New South Wales, and we have lots of beautiful beaches and bushwalks and things that we can go on. But a number of my students really weren't as lucky. They lived in a share apartment in Sydney, and they really didn't have the ability to get out and walk because of the lockdown. And I noticed that a lot of their mental health really started to deteriorate, being sort of stuck in these really constrained environments without that capacity to exercise and to sort of change their environment. And I know that there were a lot of constraints that were imposed then. Fortunately, now that we don't have them, it's still a reality that some people live in places that don't have the capacity to go out and walk in a nice leafy area or to get outdoors. So I don't know what the most practical recommendation is. The best thing I could say would be try to see if you can find ways to bake that into your life if you can, if you're fortunate enough to do so. And if not, try to find that moderation in other ways. So put down the phone and read a book, try to play, do a puzzle, try to find ways to interact with people around you that don't involve screens if you can. And if you have to, do your best to try to limit it at night. Turn off your phone when you go into bed. Try not to watch TV at night, things like this, to kind of give your brain the chance to reset and kind of recover some of the activity that needs to.
Yeah, I feel like I got a wake up call during COVID as well. I used to live in the CBD of Melbourne, which before COVID were seemed completely fine to me. It didn't seem too crowded or anything like that. And then during COVID, I was going outside to do a grocery shop for like maybe half an hour with barely anyone around, and I come back. I returned to my apartment incredibly exhausted, and then people started streaming in again after lockdown was finished, and it all just felt like way too much. Eventually I had to move out of there, and I don't know how I ever tolerated that many people before, or like that much stimulation before. So yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Mac. I feel like I learned an incredible amount from you. So I really appreciate you taking your time to be with us today. Now let's move on to the open mic section. This is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Please take it away.
Oh, thanks, Mary. It's been a really fun conversation. So I think something that I would like to sort of use the open mic for is actually directly related to what we're talking about today, which is that I think the way that we fund science nowadays in Australia, but also around the world, has really shifted from what the original intention was to a really different model that I think is really well intentioned, but I think maybe is limiting us in a really important way. The way that science used to be funded was you had a particular research question, and that research question could be something that was not related to an outcome whatsoever. It could just be, how on earth is it that a fluorescent glowworm fluoresces? What are the chemicals that are involved in that fluorescence? How does it do it? Like, what is it? How is that chemical different from the chemical that's in a glow stick? You could ask all these really basic questions, and you needn't have any application whatsoever. Nowadays, the kinds of ways that we fund science are really focused towards outcomes. As a scientist interested in how the brain works and how it fails, I constantly have to justify the need for funding, and all of my students do, and our collaborators have to justify our projects based on how they're going to make an impact, usually pretty soon for someone with a brain disorder like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And I firmly believe, and as I've tried to advocate today, that to make that progress the most effectively, we actually really need to better understand what a brain is. How do we measure it? How is it organized? How should we even think about neural activity? Is it like an orchestra? Is it like a violin? How do we even make that distinction? And that isn't going to be helpful tomorrow for someone with Parkinson's. It's just not. But in 15 years, 20 years, as we start to develop that understanding, now all of a sudden, if some brilliant biochemist has a new drug that works, we can say, hey, we expect that if the brain doesn't look like this 20 years before someone might get Parkinson's, we can identify the people at risk, you can give them the drug, and we can avert the problem. But if we try to naively jump right now into a solution, it's just premature. It's not the time for it. And so the problem is that if we're trying to fund people according to whether or not that thing will work tomorrow, we're missing all these really amazing long-term solutions that we can get that don't come from short-term goals. And so the reason I brought up the glowworm before is that this is actually a beautiful example of somewhere where this has worked completely naively in the field of neuroscience. It turns out that because a person back in the 1970s was interested in how glowworm chemicals work, back in the 2000s, a group at Stanford actually were able to use that science to develop a technology which is called optogenetics, which is that you can actually get a different, a light-sensitive chemical that can actually be turned on and off with an external light, which can now be put into a neuron, a nerve in the brain, and turn it on and off. So all of those causal mechanisms that I was talking to you about before in a mouse brain would not work if that person back in 1970 odd didn't get funded for just being curious about how a glowworm worked.
Yeah.
So I think this is a really beautiful illustrative example that science is not about getting engineering answers tomorrow. That's a really, really important and extremely important part of this big puzzle. But there's another part that has nothing to do with whether or not we'll have an answer tomorrow, but it's committed to understanding how the system works. And if we don't fund that, I think we're really missing the point. We're not actually kind of looking for the solutions where they'll be. We're looking for short-term answers for long-term problems. So anyway, that's my open mic. I'll get off my soapbox. But I'm excited to see what happens if we start to fund this type of kind of more blue sky science.
Yeah, that was a wonderful open mic, Mac. So yeah, it sounds like a great cause. And yeah, I totally agree with you there. I feel like, that there is a place to talk about applications and probable outcomes. But yeah, like you said, a lot of science back in the day wasn't based on that specifically. And we are all humans. We don't know what we don't know yet. So there's still a lot of mystery to be solved in the world. So yeah, thank you so much, Mac, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
So I have social media handles on the rapidly devolving Twitter/X. You can find me at JMacShine there. I'm also on Blue Sky for people that are involved in Blue Sky. I've also got a lab website, shinelab.org, which has access to all of our papers. A lot of them are going to be super technical. So if you do have basic questions, feel free to reach out. And if we can't help you, we can point you in the direction of one of our friends and collaborators who works in that space.
Amazing. We'll link those in the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.